all of you, how many of you like history? Show of hands. Wow, quite a few people. Okay, so keep your hands up. Those of you who have your hands up, now I want you to go like this. Okay? Because I don't want you to hear what I'm about to say. To everyone else who's still listening, I do not like history. When I was a kid in Duxbury Public Schools, history was my worst subject. I hated history. I thought it was boring. We learned about facts and dates and people I didn't know or care about, and I certainly was not interested in wars. What I was interested in were stories. So now you might think, oh, but you could have read stories about history. No. The stories that I was interested in were not what I would consider boring history stories. I liked stories where the characters, were kids like me, not George Washington or some grown-up I didn't really think too much about. Characters who did things, characters who were active, characters who had lots of things that they wanted to do in the world, even if that meant that they were going to get into trouble, especially if it meant they got into trouble. And one of my favorite characters, one of the first characters I ever really fell in love with, was Ramona Quimby. Now, some of you might remember Ramona Quimby from her very famous book, Ramona the Pest. Raise your hand, do you remember Ramona? Ramona is that quintessential character who just grabs your attention, and she does things for very good reasons, even if she ends up getting into trouble. But we root for her anyway because we love her, or at least I did. That reminds me of Beverly Cleary, my favorite author, because she wrote the books, Ramona the Pest and all of the Ramona Quimby books. I loved Beverly Cleary books. They were funny, they were full of heart, and they were about kids like me. And one of the other Beverly Cleary books that I loved was a series about Henry Huggins. Henry Huggins was Ramona's neighbor. He and Beezus were older than Ramona. They got to do a lot of good stuff, and Ramona got left behind. But there was another character in those books that I loved too, and that was Henry's dog. Henry had a dog named Ribsy, and I knew all the characters in all the books, but then Ribsy got his own book. It's just called Ribsy. I read that book, and it blew my mind because it was told from Ribsy's point of view, and he is a dog. So he's telling stories about Klickitat Street, which is a setting I was familiar with, about Henry and Beezus, and especially Ramona and Scooter McCarthy. But it was from his point of view, and I just thought, wow, this is the kind of story I like. I like a story where I can look at a situation and characters from more than one point of view. And that kind of led to a lot of other animal favorite characters that I had in books, like Charlotte's Web, Stuart Little, The Mouse on the Motorcycle, getting back to Beverly Cleary. I loved those books, and I loved those characters, and especially Wilbur. If you think about Wilbur from Charlotte's Web, Charlotte really was the brains. Charlotte did all the work. She took all the risks. And poor little Wilbur, though, he's so sweet. Everybody loved him, but he didn't believe in himself. And I think that's what made us love him all the more. So those were the kind of things that I loved stories about, not stories about history. Fast forward to a few years ago. I'm all grown up. I'm an author, and I was writing at the Drew Archives building on St. George Street, which is now owned by the Duxbury Rural and Historical Society. Back in the day, that was my library. And I had so many happy memories being in that library, especially in that reading room, because it was just like being in a big hug. It was something really familiar. And there were so many beautiful pieces of art in that room, everything from the furniture to maps and portraits. And the more time that I spent there, it wasn't just a connection with my old library. I had this curiosity about what else was going on, and I started talking to Carolyn, who's here. She's right there. who was the archivist, and I'd say, who is this and who is that, and when did they live in Duxbury, and when did that one live in Duxbury? And before you know it, we got on to the Westons and the Bradfords. So for anyone who doesn't know, this is the Westons' house. King Caesar, his name was Ezra Weston, and they were very close with their cousins, the Bradfords. And so I asked about all the members of the family, and when I heard about the youngest son, who was also named Ezra Weston, I had a lot of questions. Ezra was the youngest in the family, but there was a big age gap between him and his older brothers. Also, Ezra had a chronic condition that we now call pediatric rheumatism, but back then it wasn't very well understood. And so he was treated very differently, especially by his mother. He was really kind of treated like a baby, even when he was 12 years old. She didn't let him take part in a lot of the same things that his brothers did. They were involved in the business, but Ezra, you go play your violin. And so I imagined that he was kind of like this Ramona Quimby character, the one who was told, no, you can't go stand on the boat with everyone else, you go practice your violin. And I could just see him finding a way to sneak out and do the thing that he thought was much more important. So that kind of started to get into my heart, and I thought, I wonder if he could be a character that I might want to write about. But at the same time, I thought, there's not really enough there. Then I thought about all those other things that I liked when I was a kid. You know, I thought about different points of view. I thought about those animals, and I thought, well, what if I had my own little mouse like Stuart Little, or the mouse on the motorcycle? But not that kind of personality, maybe more like Wilbur. Maybe a little mouse who didn't believe in himself, but he had a quest and he had to try to prove himself the way that Ezra had to prove himself as well. And then I thought of another thing that I really love about stories is when two stories are told at the same time, from two different points of view, and they weave together, and then at the end they tell one big story. I left out one other thing that I used to enjoy when I was a kid, and that was Encyclopedia Brown. Does anyone remember him? Encyclopedia Brown, he was a kid, and he solved mysteries, and he always solved the mystery. And I could go through those books like candy and get to the end, and the mystery was always solved. So here I am thinking of an idea, and I thought, what if I had Ezra, and what if I had a mouse, and what if there was a mystery? And that's how I started the idea of Ezra and the Mouse. But it didn't really all come together until I started to think about what else was going on in the 1820s in America. Because Ezra was 12 years old in 1822. And that's when I decided I wanted to set my story. There wasn't a whole lot going on in 1822. There were no big wars. There were no major catastrophes that happened. But there was something very, very big that did happen in that time period, and it involved Lafayette. So I started doing a lot of research about Lafayette because I didn't really know that much about him. But while I was doing that research, I discovered a very, very obscure true story about Lafayette that I'll bet nobody here knows what it is, unless you've read the book. And I saved that for the end, so I can't tell you what it is, but it totally involved the mice storyline. So with all of that said, I want to say that when I was a kid, if Ezra and the Mouse, The Search for Lafayette, had been available to me, I think I might have liked history. So, to illustrate my point, I would like to read 2.5 pages from the book. Normally, when I'm doing a book reading, I start on page 1 and I read the beginning. This book, the chapters are every other chapter. Ezra, Mouse, the mouse is named Birdie. Ezra, Birdie, Ezra, Birdie. So I didn't want to read chapter 1 to you because that is an Ezra chapter. And I think Ezra is a little easier for you to grasp than the mice. But there is a little story at the end of chapter 2 that Birdie tells to his sister. And if you listen very closely, there's a lot in this story that foreshadows the rest of the book. So, and you'll get to meet the mice. Birdie and his sister Olive are trapped in a bird cage in Ezra's room, and Olive is injured. And that's all you need to know. Olive cautiously crawled over and nestled against him. "Would you tell me a story?" "A story?" He sniffed. "Really?" "I want to hear one of Papa's stories," Olive said, her voice weak and gentle. "Please, Birdie, it would make me feel better." Birdie stroked Olive's head. Just thinking of Papa's stories weighed on his heart. Story time was when the whole family gathered around in a cozy heap, all warm and squirmy. But how could he say no? It was the one thing he could do for her right now. He knew Papa's stories by heart. They both did. "Start at the beginning," Olive said. Birdie nodded and took in a deep breath. "All right. When Papa was a young mouse, he loved to scamper around the harbor back in Boston. That was where the big ships sailed in from faraway places like France and England and Salem. The seafaring mice strutted along the wharf telling tales of adventure and food. Papa said it was glorious. He wanted to be one of those mice." Olive gave him a nudge. "Don't forget about the cheese." "I'm getting to that." Birdie twirled a whisker the way Papa always did. "The French mice were always bragging, 'Ooh la la, France has the best of everything,' they said." And the Boston mice grumbled, "The only good thing that came out of France was Lafayette." Olive tapped his paw. "That's a kind of cheese." Birdie had always wondered what a Lafayette was. Yes, the only thing they agreed about was the cheese. Papa wanted that cheese. He decided to scurry aboard the very next ship for France. "Papa's very brave," Olive said. "Adventurous, too. And clever," Birdie added. "He knew it was a French ship because of the flag, the stripes of blue, white, and red. He boarded that ship, ready for a long, long trip." "France is at the top of the world," Olive said. Clearly, she knew more than he did. "Anyway," Birdie went on, "it was a hard day at sea. The wind, the waves, how the ship swayed. Papa clutched onto a rope, his belly cramped in pain. He thought it couldn't get worse, but then he inhaled a terrible odor, a burning cigar. He could hardly breathe. Papa said it was the most wretched hour of his life." Olive sighed. "Poor Papa." When the ship finally sailed into calm waters, the sun was low in the sky, and the full moon was rising. It was winter, and evening was coming. But Papa wasn't tired. He couldn't wait for that Lafayette. "The wondrous cheese!" Olive cried. As soon as the ship docked, Papa scampered onto the wharf. It was much, much smaller than the wharf in Boston, and when he looked around, he couldn't believe his eyes. The place was deserted. Where were the ships? Where were the people? Where were the mice? All Papa saw were a couple of buildings and barrels, and the few people from his same ship. He expected France to be a lot bigger and a lot more exciting. Of course he did. Birdie twirled his whiskers some more. Papa darted about the wharf full of confusion. He didn't smell any cheese, only that terrible cigar. He had almost reached the road when he heard a sound that captured his attention. "Mama!" Olive shouted. A beautiful young mouse was in trouble. Mama ran through the snow, shrieking in panic. She had fled old King Caesar's house when the servant girl chased her with a broom. Scurrying toward the wharf, Mama had narrowly escaped being eaten by a cat, a hawk, and even a fox. By the time she met Papa, she was exhausted and close to death. He noticed her distress and rushed to her aid. Papa swept her off her paws, Olive sighed. Of course Papa hadn't made it to France after all. But it must have been fate, because ending up in Duxbury united him with Mama. Birdie blinked back a tear. Each time Papa retold the story, he and Olive would snuggle against Mama's warm body. Though Mama loved the story as much as the rest of the mice, he knew the memories upset her because she would gasp and gasp, her heart pounding and pounding. Now, trapped in the cage with poor injured Olive, he'd give anything to feel Mama's heart thudding against him once again. "I can't finish," he said. "That's okay, Bertie," Olive said. "I know how it ends." Bertie sunk to his belly and gazed at his sister. He never knew a mouse could feel so much love and so much sadness at the same time. So those of you who are paying extra close attention, I'm sure you could figure out that if you were reading this book together with your kids, it could provoke a lot of discussion. Like about assumptions that the mice made and what was really happening, which I personally think that kind of stuff is really cool. So we have a few minutes left for questions. Sure. I would love to hear if any of you have any questions about the book, about writing the book, about King Caesar, about being an author, about Duxbury. Any questions that you have. This is your chance.
I have one. How long did it take you to write the book?
How long did it take me to write the book? This book was very unusual for me. This is the only time I have ever written a historical fiction book, so I was literally doing some of the research at the same time that I was writing the first draft. So it actually didn't take me as long to write the book as you might think. I think I started in the fall, and I think I was finished by May, which is really crazy. That's fast for me. And it didn't take a lot of rewriting either. It took some rewriting, so I would say it was less than a year, which is really extraordinary. It really is. But then, of course, it took many years after that to get it published. It kind of makes up for it. Yes?
I heard a rumor that Caroline in the book was based on Carolyn Ransom's book. Is that true?
Yes. So have you read the book?
No, but
You just heard her. So Carolyn was my partner in crime for sure. I could never, ever, ever have written the book without her. And I did place her in the story. She's one of the housekeepers in the Weston family. So when you see her, her name is Caroline in the book. That's Carolyn. Yes, Ellie?
So in Fenway and Hattie, you researched Fenway by basing it on your dog Kipper.
Mm-hmm.
So I've known you for a while, and I don't think you have a pet mouse.
No.
So how did you research the point of view of the mouse?
That is a great question. I have done a lot of research about mice, which isn't quite as easy to do, right? Because it's all about like how to take care of your pet mouse, and I wanted to write about a mouse who was in the wild. So a lot of those things didn't mesh. I actually got a lot of information from Jan Brett. She has a lot of information on her website about how mice use their whiskers, which I took a lot from that. And then I took a lot of inspiration from other books about mice, since I'm so well read on them. But I had to do a lot of research about like, can mice swim? You know, what would happen to a mouse if their leg got, stepped on by a horse? Things like that actually happen. What can mice eat? It's not like they're going to Petco and buying pellets to feed the mice. So so there was a lot of that going on. I had a lot of fun with the mice.
You did a great job.
Thank you. Yes, Ellie was one of my readers.
Get one over here.
What's your question?
How many other books have you written?
How many other books have I written? So Ezra and the Mouse, The Search for Lafayette is my 5th book so far. But I have written 3 additional books that are going to be published very soon. So I've written 8, and very soon that will be 9. Yes?
For any of the young writers in the audience, at what point did you think, this is something I can do? This is something I can publish?
Yeah.
just this book, but
It's a
just
good
going
question.
From being someone who enjoyed writing as a younger person to realizing this is something I can actually do as part of my profession.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hope everyone could hear it. It was at what point did I realize that writing for a job is something that I wanted to do? It was way later in my life. It wasn't when I was a kid. I did not enjoy writing as a kid. And as I talked about my reading life as a kid, it was pretty selective. I didn't read everything. I just read the books that I liked. And I didn't think I would become a writer. I never did. But it was when I became an adult, a mom in particular, my kids are here, I read to my kids every night for an hour until they were in 8th grade. And we read all those same books that I just mentioned, plus we read all the newer books. And it was sometime along that journey that I thought to myself that I knew it would be really hard. I certainly never thought I would write a book from a dog's point of view, but I thought I would really like to write the kind of book that I thought my family would like to read. Nick?
Did growing up in Duxbury help you to write interesting stories about Duxbury in the stories?
For sure. I mean, I dove into a lot of my own feelings and a lot of my own emotions about the town, about the water, about all kinds of things in the story. And I intentionally went to those places in myself and attributed them to Ezra. And there are certainly even some lines in the story. And Ezra's part of a very prominent family, but he doesn't feel connected to them because he's kind of on the outside. But I see writing this story as a lot of connections. It was a connection for me to connect to a family from 200 years ago, to connect to the town, to connect to my own memories from way back when I was a kid, and then to connect to my feelings now. So I felt like there were a lot of connections, from everything. For those people who live here, it's like you can always tell if it's low tide because you can smell it, right? I mean, like as soon as Ezra walks out his door, he knows it's low tide, and things like that. Or when he looks out at the water, he thinks about how connected he feels to that water, and that's how I feel about that water. So yes, I absolutely used my knowledge of the town and of my own memories, feelings, and emotions in rounding out the character of Ezra. Yes.
Did someone help you write the book?
Yes, I had quite a few helpers. I have 2 friends who are not here who did a lot of help. I had one friend who actually helped me brainstorm like the whole plot. I had another friend who helped me with the very, very beginning of the story to make sure I was setting it at the right place. And then I had another friend who is here who read the whole book and told me that my ending was wrong and I had to change it. And so those are 3 people who helped. But the biggest helper that I had was Carolyn Ravenscroft, who is still sitting inside the door. She was my partner every single step of the way because I had so many questions for her. And she was very generous about providing lots and lots of information. Anybody else? So I believe we have some books for people who don't already have them.
Right. So if you're interested in purchasing books, you can join us at this little table.